Christmas shopping is supposed to be fun, but this year it became the most terrifying experience of my life. Last week, my friend Veronica and I were doing some last-minute shopping. The stores were packed, and we spent most of the time weaving through crowds, joking about bad gift ideas. Then we ended up in the candy aisle. Veronica was debating between truffles and a mixed bag of chocolates, and I stood nearby, zoned out. That's when a voice startled me. "So, you like chocolate?" At first, I thought the man was talking to Veronica. But when I looked up, he was staring right at me, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. Yeah," I said, unsure how to react. He took a step closer. "Me too. White chocolate's my favorite." But I think, his eyes dragged over me from head to toe. "I think you might be my new favorite." He licked his lips, grinned, and added, "See you later, Toots," before walking off. I felt frozen, and Veronica looked just as unsettled. "Do you know him?" she whispered. "No," I muttered, brushing it off as a creepy stranger. Unfortunately, it wasn't the end. The next day, I went to a local store in my small town. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw him, the man from the candy aisle, walking out of the store. I didn't want another encounter, so I left and went to a shop across town instead. When I got home, I noticed a truck pulling into my shared driveway. Thinking it was a neighbor, I didn't pay much attention, until I heard the back door handle jiggling. Someone was on my porch, trying to get in. Heart pounding, I crept to the window and peeked outside. There he was. The same man. He stepped off my porch and got into a blue truck. My stomach dropped. Had he followed me? I stayed locked inside for the rest of the day, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But by evening, I started to relax, until I remembered a package I needed to grab from the mailbox. It was dark, and the street was eerily quiet as I walked out. Then I heard a vehicle. The same blue truck slowed as it passed my house, and my unease grew. I hurried back to the door, fumbling with my keys. As I opened it, I heard his voice. "Hey! I've been looking for you." He was leaning out of his truck, grinning like this was some kind of game. Before I could say anything, he parked in the middle of the street and started getting out. I bolted inside, slamming the door and locking it. But I wasn't fast enough. Before I could secure the deadbolt, the door shook as he slammed into it. I pressed my weight against it, trying to hold it shut. The chain lock was the only thing keeping him out. He leaned into the gap, his face twisted into something both angry and manic. "You can't keep me out," he hissed. "Let's stop fighting, Toots. You know you love me. Let me in." I panicked and did the only thing I could. I punched him through the gap. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to slam the door shut and lock it completely. My hands were shaking as I called the police. When they arrived, he was gone. They said they'd patrol the area but couldn't do much unless he came back. The calls started the next day. Dozens of voicemails, each more vulgar and deranged than the last. His voice was calm, even cheerful, but his words were sickening. "Hey, Toots. I miss you. Can't wait to see you again. You're mine, sweet chocolate. Don't fight me, you'll only make it harder." I saved one of the less graphic messages to play for the police, but they still said their hands were tied unless he physically harmed me. By Christmas Eve, I was living in fear. I wouldn't leave the house alone, and every sound outside made me jump. Then, suddenly, the calls stopped. No explanation, no final message, just silence. For a moment, I felt relief. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching. Who was he? Why did he choose me? And how did he find me? I don't have answers, but I'll never forget his voice on those voicemails or the sight of his face peeking through my door. I grew up in a quiet Midwest town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and crime is practically non-existent. With a population of just over 20,000, it felt like a bubble of safety. That's why the events of 2008 still haunt me. They shattered the illusion of security I once took for granted. I was about to turn 19 and decided it was time to finally celebrate my birthday with a real party. I'd graduated from a private Christian high school the year before, and my social life up to that point had been pretty tame. College hadn't changed much. I was the small-town girl blending into the crowd. But that summer, everything shifted. I dropped out of college, broke up with my boyfriend, and started hanging out with a new, livelier group of friends. They loved parties, and their stories made me curious. So, for my 19th birthday, I decided to throw a party, complete with alcohol, for the first time. The party was a hit. My friends loved my house, a 3-bedroom place with an attached garage. It had plenty of space for people to hang out, crash, and even play beer pong. After that night, my house became the go-to spot every weekend. People I barely knew, or didn't know at all, started showing up, but it didn't bother me. One of my friends always claimed they'd invited the newcomers, and as long as nothing got damaged, I didn't mind. Then September rolled around, and something strange happened. One morning, as I was heading to work, I noticed the remote for my garage door was missing from my car's sun visor. I assumed it had fallen or been misplaced during one of the parties, but after searching everywhere, under seats, in the house, I gave up. That same night, my phone rang during my lunch break at work. The caller ID displayed unavailable. Assuming it was a prank, I answered, but there was only silence on the other end. I hung up, irritated but not overly concerned. The calls didn't stop. Every day, at seemingly perfect times, when I'd just woken up, during my lunch break, or right as I got home from work, my phone would ring. Always unavailable. Always silent. It felt like whoever was calling knew my schedule, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. Things escalated when I stopped parking in the garage. One morning, as I backed out of my driveway, I heard a horrible scraping noise. Huge tree branches had been shoved under my car. A week later, a massive branch was propped against my front door. I called my best friend Lacey in a panic, and she let me stay at her place for the night. But even there, the calls followed. My phone rang, and moments later, Lacey's phone lit up with the same unavailable caller. We were terrified. I reported everything to the police, but they couldn't trace blocked calls, and nothing came of their patrols in my neighborhood. Meanwhile, the harassment continued. More tree branches appeared around my house. Napkins and candy wrappers were left on my porch and car. Once, I found stacks of blank paper scattered across my lawn. It felt calculated, like whoever was doing this wanted me to feel watched and powerless. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. I was driving to my grandfather's farm when my phone rang again. I snapped, screaming into the silence, begging them to stop and let me have peace for just one day. But, as always, there was no response. A few nights later, I woke up on my couch to see multiple flashlights shining through my windows. Panicked, I locked myself in the bathroom and called Lacey, who rushed over. By the time we searched the property, whoever had been outside was gone. The calls continued, but the branches and odd items stopped. I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then one morning, I noticed my garage door was open. I hadn't used it in weeks. Inside, sitting neatly on my dining table, was the missing garage door remote. Someone had been inside my house. That was it. I called Lacey, packed my things, and moved to a new city within weeks. The calls stopped almost immediately. I thought I was finally free. But on Valentine's Day, while spending the day with Lacey, we returned to her car after a movie to find my phone lying on the ground next to the driver's door. I had left it charging in her kitchen. To this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Whoever they were, they invaded my life for months, watching me, taunting me, and staying just out of reach. And whoever they were, they're still out there. When I was 25, I finally left the shared house I'd been living in for years and moved into my own place, an old, one-bedroom apartment in the heart of the city. It was far from perfect, cracked walls, outdated appliances, and an unmistakable musty smell. But it was mine, and that made all the difference. The location couldn't have been better, just a short walk from the city's most popular nightlife spots and conveniently close to my workplace. For someone who loved going out with friends, it was a dream come true. I moved in on a Friday and spent most of the day unpacking. By evening, the place still looked cluttered, but I didn't care. I decided to celebrate my newfound freedom with a housewarming party. I invited a bunch of friends over for drinks before we hit the clubs. My tiny apartment quickly filled with people, and the overflow spilled onto the walkway outside my door. Music blasted from my speakers, and laughter echoed down the hall. It was exactly the kind of night I'd envisioned. Amid the fun, I noticed something strange. Between songs, I heard shouting coming from the apartment next door. The building's walls were paper thin, and it was impossible to miss the commotion. Curious, I pressed my ear against the wall. From what I could gather, two men were arguing. One, with a deep and aggressive voice, was furious about the noise. The other, softer spoken, seemed to be trying to calm him down. I hadn't met my neighbors yet, but this wasn't the introduction I'd hoped for. Not wanting to cause trouble, I told my friends it was time to head to the clubs. We left, and I didn't give the incident much more thought. When I got back later that night, it was close to 2 a.m. My friends had stayed out, but I was too tired to keep going. As I approached my door, I noticed a figure leaning against the railing of the walkway. It was a man, smoking a cigarette. He was tall and lanky, with greasy brown hair that hung over his face. In the dim light, I noticed he had a faint black eye and a split lip, as though he'd been in a recent fight. I decided to be polite. "Good day, mate." "Sorry about the noise earlier," I said, hoping to smooth things over. The man looked up and gave me a weak smile. "Nah, you're all right, mate." "I'm Chris," he replied, extending his hand. As I shook his hand, I noticed his knuckles. They were red, swollen, and scraped, as if he'd been punching something, or someone. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Hope I didn't cause any trouble for you," I mumbled. Chris shrugged, withdrawing his hand. "Rick just gets a bit cranky sometimes," he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Something about his tone made me uneasy. I offered a polite goodbye and slipped into my apartment, locking the door behind me. Over the next few weeks, I started to piece together what life was like next door. Almost every night, Chris and Rick would argue. Their fights were loud and heated, with Rick's deep, commanding voice dominating the exchanges. Chris's responses were always quieter, more apologetic. It was clear who was in charge. Sometimes, I'd hear my name mentioned in their arguments. Rick would accuse Chris of watching me or being interested in me. It made me uncomfortable, but I convinced myself it wasn't my problem. I avoided interacting with them and stopped bringing friends over. I'd throw on my headphones, drown out the noise with music or video games, and pretend everything was fine. Then came Christmas Eve. I'd spent the day rushing through last-minute shopping and was looking forward to a quiet evening wrapping gifts. When I pulled into the building's parking lot, I immediately noticed the flashing lights of 2 police cars. My stomach tightened as I climbed out of my car. Anna, an elderly woman who lived a few doors down, was standing in the walkway, sobbing uncontrollably. "What happened?" I asked her. "It's just so sad," she managed through her tears, shaking her head. I looked toward the commotion and saw 3 police officers struggling to restrain someone on the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was Chris. His brown hair was matted with sweat and blood, and his face was a mess. His jaw had been sliced open, the skin hanging loosely. He was muttering something incoherent, his voice weak and trembling. Blood stained the officers' uniforms and pooled on the ground beneath him. Then I heard a voice, a deep, angry voice that cut through the chaos. "You see what you've done, you expletive loser. Just kill yourself." I froze. It was Rick. But as I scanned the area, I couldn't see him. The voice was coming from Chris. My mind struggled to make sense of what I was hearing. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. There was no Rick. All the arguments, the shouting, the accusations, they had all been Chris. His voice had changed, transforming into the angry, abusive Rick during his outbursts. Everything I'd heard over the past few weeks had been him fighting with himself. I backed away, my heart pounding. Anna's sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I rushed to my apartment, locked the door, and collapsed on the couch, shaking. A few days later, Anna filled in the blanks. Chris suffered from severe mental illness and had been in and out of psychiatric hospitals for years. His father owned the apartment, so it was always waiting for him when he was discharged. The fights I'd overheard weren't just the product of a troubled man, they were the manifestations of a fractured mind. To this day, I can't forget Chris, or Rick. Living next to him was a stark reminder of how little we truly know about the people around us. Some battles are invisible, fought behind closed doors and within the depths of a person's mind. And sometimes, the scariest thing of all is realizing how close we are to that darkness without even knowing it.